Hello and welcome to Morningstar. With me today is Niklas Kammer. He is equity analyst for Morningstar, and he is here to discuss with me today the European banking sector. Now, Niklas, the macroeconomic situation is challenging, to say the least. How does that affect European banks?
Yeah, that is true, Antje. So banks are obviously closely tied to the economies they operate in, and with that, the outlook for the European banks in the short term is increasingly uncertain as well and increasingly volatile. Throughout Europe, we see inflation rising rapidly, primarily due to tight labor markets and higher energy prices. And central banks have responded to this rising inflation by raising interest rates across the continent, with only the ECB yet to increase its deposit rate, but they will do so most likely this July. Despite these short-term uncertainties and the potential for a recession in Europe, we do see some positives for banks, for the banking sector overall. So we expect that when the current uncertainty settles eventually and inflation slows, that interest rates will not revert back to a negative or close to zero territory again, but they will remain positive. And this is a structural benefit to all European banks, but it is especially important for banks we view as moody or with a competitive advantage. So in a negative rate environment, these banks were not able to benefit from the cheap and stable deposit funding base, which we believe gives a bank a competitive advantage. So with the interest rate environment changing now structurally, we would also expect that these competitively advantaged banks will perform better than their peers.
Well, that's very interesting. But let's take a look at the short term. What do you expect to see in the short term?
Yeah, that is also a very good question, because I already touched on the inflationary picture, of course, but I also would want to highlight, which is more important for the short term, that the credit cycle is likely to turn as well. So we're coming out of a very benign credit environment. We have had massive stimulus by governments and also central banks by central banks, which has kept businesses and households afloat during the pandemic. But we are starting to see now the first signs of credit quality worsening. So, for example, if you look at the junk yields, they are increasing, showing that the risk of default for corporates is perceived to be higher. Unemployment rates are still healthy, which suggests that retail banking is doing a little bit better still, or is a bit earlier in the cycle. But with rising interest rates, more households will likely see their disposable income weaken as well. So what does it mean for banks? So banks' internal risk models typically pick up on these indicators that I just mentioned, among other things such as GDP growth outlook, for example. And this forces banks to start provisioning now on a forward-looking basis for tougher times ahead. So we therefore expect that the focus in the next earnings season, which is in front of our doorstep, will move towards asset quality, loan loss provisioning for bad debts, and balance sheet management, more generally speaking.
And what is your conclusion? Which European banks might fare well in this environment?
Yeah, we at the moment really like four narrow mode banks the most, which are ABN Amro, Lloyd, Handelsbanken, and UBS. ABN Amro and Lloyd we like for many of the same reasons. So both banks have dominant franchises in their respective markets, and they can count on a very strong and solid deposit funding base, as I just highlighted, what we think makes a bank moody. Their loan book is also dominated by mortgages, which has been a major headwind during the low interest rate environment over the last years. But given the new interest rate outlook, we expect both banks to benefit disproportionately. Then we like Handelsbanken, which we think is one of the highest quality banks in Europe. The bank has a strong credit quality record and has historically really outperformed their peers when the credit cycle turns sour. And we expect a similar picture to emerge this time around. And we believe that Handelsbanken really offers a very good risk-adjusted upside at the moment. And then lastly, we like UBS because of its growth drivers, which are not really tied to the current very uncertain environments, and the growth drivers being primarily the growth of high net worth individuals in emerging markets and the aging population globally. Also, a benefit for UBS is that Swiss banks are often seen as a safe haven in times of trouble. One thing to highlight, though, is that investors will be exposed to some more volatile results from UBS's investment banking units, so they have some investment banking exposure. But overall, we believe that the core of UBS, its private banking business, will keep performing well in this current environment, and will keep pushing the group forward.
Well, that's very interesting. Well, Niklas, thank you so much for making the time and sharing this information with us. For Morningstar, I'm Antje Schiffler.